Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Manchester Poetry Library. I think we've got a few more people still coming who are wandering in the back, but thank you everyone for being here. Thank you if you're returning, but also special thanks. Welcome to anyone who's here for the first time. My name's Martin. I'm the Poetry Library's project manager. Halfway through that, I couldn't remember where that sentence was going. It's been a long day. We've done solstice walks. For some of you, you have done 2 intense days of creative writing. Your brains must be absolutely fried. So we're here to finish them off with some more food for thought, and then you can go and sleep for a whole weekend. I wouldn't blame you. So, housekeeping. There's no fire alarm planned, so if there's a fire alarm, please make your way to All Saints Park. Please do get up and help yourselves to drinks, and the toilets are on your right as you leave the Poetry Library. If this is your very first time here and your first time in the space and you would like to find out about membership, just ask me. We are being live streamed, so I also I'm not looking up towards the heavens, I'm looking up towards the cameras to say welcome everyone who's joining us online. It's a real pleasure to have you here in the space with us today. I also just want to say on a personal note, so I've done the housekeeping, but this event was started last year, kind of corralled together by our colleague Charlotte Shevchenko-Knight, who then couldn't make that one. And then we thought, oh, don't worry, Charlotte, we'll get you this year. She's not here again, even though this kind of was a brainchild of hers that has now spiraled beyond her reach and control. I'm sure he'll get her somewhere, but I just want to sort of acknowledge Charlotte's kind of support in all this. It's especially meaningful to me also partly because I did my PhD here a long time ago now, what it feels like. But a lot of the thinking I did then has found its way into my work here. So there is something really, I hope the Poetry Library it tries to be as supportive as it can to the postgraduate community here. So I'm just really, really excited to have you here and to hear your thoughts. And also, yeah, I'm going to stop there, or I will just keep rambling on. But also, you're just in for a treat in terms of poetry and thinking and all that. And now, with a special thanks to Francesca, I'd like to welcome Francesca, who's going to introduce our evening.
Thanks so much, Martin, and thank you to all of you for coming out on another hot Manchester evening. So this event, as Martin has already said, is the kind of final event in the Manchester Writing School's Summer Festival, but it's also part of this reading series that Charlotte Shevchenko-Knight set up called Entangled. And this is a PhD showcase that sees some of our really brilliant Manchester Met PhD researchers and poets unravel the themes and forms which connect each poet's work to the other. So tonight we're going to hear from Mark, Anita and Domenic. Sorry, I'm conscious that I'm turning away from the microphone. I'm not used to it. And I'll introduce them all in a minute. But before that, I was just going to say a little bit about how tonight will work. So we're going to start with some readings. All 3 of our poets are going to read for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move into a discussion, untangling some of those promised connections between their poetry, writing, and research. And then there'll be some time for questions from you all at the end as well, if you've got questions. So do have a think about what you might like to ask as well. So first now I'll introduce Mark Pajak. He's going to be our first poet. So Mark's work has received a Northern Writers Award, a Society of Authors grant, an Eric Gregory Award, and a UNESCO International Writing Residency. And his first collection, Slide, available here in the Poetry Library, was shortlisted for both the T.S. Eliot Prize and the John Pollard International Poetry Prize, and won the Seamus Heaney First Collection Poetry Prize. And of course, he's a PhD researcher here at Man Met as well. So thank you, Mark.
Hello. My book isn't available here because I've pinched it, so you can't get it here. Sorry. So, can you hear me? Good? Nice. So my PhD isn't a creative PhD, it's a purely critical one. And so I'm working with young people in schools, and I'm not producing poetry at the moment, so I'm going to read one of my older poems and then I'm going to read 2 poems that were suggested by my participants who are primary school children. So you've got something to look forward to. But this first one is mine, and it's called After Closing Time. Me and my best friend Joe used to do terrible things to each other. We used to dare each other to do things. He set fire to me once. I let him, which says something about me. But one night we got very drunk. We were about 15 or something. And we decided to go to a bridge and hang off the bridge and dare each other to let go. And this is what happened. After closing time. For Joe. We head to the edge of town, to the Black River and Old Stone Bridge. 2 boys full of vodka, tipping side to side like flames. And for a laugh, we climb the railings and hang from our arms. Below in the deep, 2 boys peer up at us over their feet. Like drops of water, we are gathering ourselves to fall. One of us says, "You go first." And we echo this back and forth. We are here for a very long time. Years, in fact. I marry, divorce. You skip all that, become a father. We see less and less of each other. Now we are what the world considers men, which is to say, we've learned that falling is inevitable. Yet here we are still, side by side, 2 boys way past closing time, holding on until the other lets go. I once read that to Joe and he went, "What?" So I hope you liked it. So these 2, I've been working for the last 2 weeks in a primary school, which is our first research site of 2. Our research question is, what does poetry do for young lives? And we've been asking them to make films about poetry. And I asked them to select some poems for today. And I think this poem is a good introduction because it introduces the area of Wirral and Merseyside. It's Cousin Reggie by Roger McGough. Cousin Reggie, who adores the sea, lives in the Midlands, unfortunately. He surfs down escalators in department stores. He swims the high street on all 4s. Sunbathes on the pavement, paddles in the gutter. I think our Reggie's a bit of a nutter. And this last one is Do Not Feed the Animals by Robert Hull. And of the ones that were suggested for tonight, I like this one because it suggests something that I'll go into more in depth later. But please do not feed the animals. Please do not feed the ostriches sandwiches, or the polar bears eclairs. Do not offer the wombats kumquats, or the rattlesnakes fruitcakes. Remember that piranhas are not allowed bananas, or partridges sausages. Never approach a stork with things on a fork, or the bustard with a plate of custard. No leopard likes anything peppered, and meerkats dislike Kit Kats. Remember that grapes upset apes, and meringues do the same for orangutans. Most importantly, do not feed the cheetah your teacher. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was brilliant, both to hear your poetry and to hear what the students have just chosen after your time with them. So next up, we've got Anita Slater, who's an interdisciplinary writer and doctoral researcher, currently exploring the poetics of guidance in the city through the Leverhulme Unit for the Design of Cities of the Future, again, here at Manchester Met. So take it away, Anita.
Thank you. Yes, thanks. That's perfect. Hello. My whole PhD, as Fran said, is all about guidance, and I've kind of changed 1,000 times how I explain my PhD project to people. It's just every time I talk to people, I decide it's something else or it progresses into something else. But essentially, I kind of look at forms like guidebooks, manuals, any kind of like reference texts or guided forms, and I kind of think about their relationship to poetry. And actually, what I'm going to read from is it is poetry. It's a short story that I wrote a while ago, and I'm pulling it apart into poems. And for context, the short story was originally about, I know a lot of the time we don't like to say something's about something, but I think context in this case is important. It's kind of about a young protagonist who gets commissioned by a very, very elderly lady to write a series of manuals on any topic. And she kind of isn't given any instruction for what that manual needs to include, and she struggles a lot with it. But it's just a very random selection of bits from that. Okay. Like a travelling sales bag of various kinds of poplin things, grey and peach and margarine, I've picked a small thing up in a striated seaside town in a shop full of some such. The town's template equals town. Most recent venture is the less recent announcement that a mega celebrity artist, like the ones you read that people have read about in newspapers, has had their letters discovered. Letters much like a list sprawled on a gargoyle. And on these letters, they have left heartily specific instructions for how to place, hold, handle, detach, reverse, sedate, transpire, antiquate, mimic, round off, solidify, and expunge their paintings, which would be completely well and good and all those sorts of things, if not for the fact that this striated seaside town has already made up quite a complex and high-profile image on the basis that the artist is as relaxed as a hollowed-out fruit. Oh. Just going to put this here. A robotic knuckled voice is pulling me into sleep, and it's the strange kind of voice I often get just in those moments drifting off that resembles two things. One, being a person in a cartoon that is speaking and behaving in reverse. Their voice and body are going backwards mechanically as though to make an animated point or because they are in shock. Two, as though I am waking up, but I'm not awake yet, and the voice is trying to wake me up. I do not sleep though, because I'm in my local library, and as much as I'd want to sleep, I can't, for many reasons, the main one being that I need to carry on with these ideas. And so far, I have only in front of me an events planner with no special events coming up. And the second reason is that I'm constantly being interrupted by sounds that can only be characterized by a birthday party. But a birthday party isn't happening, and there are many signs in the library that say no birthday parties. I'm hearing an incessant rustling and unwrapping of paper, and a munching on something that can only be referred to as cake, and a scruffling of something very much like confetti rings. It's only when I leave the library to go in search of a special event that I realize all the sounds are coming from separate people and separate things. But in the meantime, it's made me think I need to organize my own birthday party. Sitting in a cafe, I think of the point at which bulgur wheat meets paving slab. The pavement slabs resemble something like cheekily open envelopes, and the bulgur wheat and slab coalesce together as they meet on the floor. They're having a special event, and I haven't been invited. Having no lunch anymore, I muse on, as cheery as apricots. I make my way home, hoping that my hot water bottle, shaped kind of like an ear, is still in the same place as I left it. When I fill it, I start drifting into thinking about birthday cakes and surprises and a book I saw in a shop a long time ago that had a pattern on the front shaped like a birthday cake. I printed this out in a weird way. Guided Journal Entry 1. I've been lying awake in bed at night for several hours. This is not typical for me, as usually I get between 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night and feel vaguely well rested in the morning. But I've been worrying about what I'm going to base the 3 handbooks for Violetta on, as we had provisionally come up with an April deadline and I was nowhere near even vaguely choosing themes. I'm using this space to argue with myself about how best to handle the space given to me on this page. It says to write down all the ways in which different people make me feel and to tick the boxes underneath that list several different types of feeling, like gushy, clownish, wired, striated. I've spent a long time lying in bed thinking this is all nonsense, as I can't possibly think of someone making me feel clownish, as really they make me feel more like a clown's assistant, like someone who helps me with colourful handkerchiefs and hats and a cold nose and slippers. But the angrier I get about the fact that there isn't an option for someone making you feel like a clown's assistant, I realise that maybe they do actually make me feel clownish, particularly when we're eating pretzels together and the poppy seeds or sesame seeds get stuck in between my central and lateral incisors, and when I smile somewhat clownishly, it looks like a set of ellipsis has made a home in my mouth. And I just have one more. How to be a git. Don't think about it much, just be yourself. This is what my twin sister said to me one day about a year ago. When we had an argument because I told her that someone had made me feel like spray-on candy floss, and it was so lovely and sticky and warm, and she said that they shouldn't make you feel like that, because it would make you do silly things like the thing I did the week before the argument, which was to misread a sign saying copying book support as conversation book support, because I'd been feeling particularly emotional that day. And this had led, after several minutes of confusing dialogue with the photocopier assistant, to photocopying a private conversation between myself and my twin, which I didn't know was private, but found out during the argument that it was. For the whole rest of the day of the argument, she would mimic everything I was doing, inserting only the words, "You've forgotten your line, darling. Please mail it to me." And after a while, this ended up being quite funny, and we both laughed like clowns for a good hour. That's it.
Thanks so much, Anita. That was brilliant. I can see we've already got lots to talk about in terms of hybrid forms and pulling things apart. So last but not least, we've got Domenic Suntrapak, who's a second-year PhD student whose research examines linguistic and symbolic ties between poetry, architecture, and urban planning. And his own poetry frequently blurs the line between the animate and the inanimate to investigate notions of embodiment. And you can find some of his poetry in Levy magazine. Have I said that right? Levy, okay. The Vanity Papers, and also Words from the Water, which was launched here, I think. So, yeah, hand over to Domenic.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can stoop a little if I need to. What can I say to that? I think embodiment is something I think about a lot, but I think there's also just something to be said that I'm very fixated in my own writing on anatomy, things that are in the body or come from the body or that maybe end up in the body that didn't start there. And this first little poem I have is sort of like my one poetic party trick. And some of you know this already, so if you've heard this spiel before, you'll have to forgive me. Most of you probably know like Homer and the Odyssey and all that fun Greek stuff. Shakespeare, we have iambic pentameter. Homer wrote in dactylic hexameters, and how dactyls work as opposed to iambs is if you take your left hand and you look at your first finger, you will see one long notch and 2 short notches, and that is one dactyl. Use that however you will. I myself am honestly quite terrible at using prosody, and I think this poem maybe came out of a sort of prosody angst or prosody anxiety. And it's old, but still I think a work in progress. and I've been fiddling with the title, which after some input, including from today, has wound up being Untitled, bracket, formerly pop, bracket, aka the dactyl poem. Words fester in our bones, phrases thick and thin, twinning out along each metacarpal. The old masters watched dactyls worm their way across each finger, folding over each beat, listening to the slight pause of a trochee, exhaled with each crack of an aged knuckle. In every tired hand, a withered book, pages of cartilage crowd one another, stretch dermal binding that craves release, and the swell of new punishment. This second one, I think, in part, since I've been working, and I don't think I'll get too much into the architecture just yet, but thinking also about bodies, I'm also often preoccupied with materials of a more physical nature in relation to the body, and thinking about our interaction with buildings and built spaces, metal and bricks and glass. And to be honest, my output since I started the PhD for poetry has been somewhat awful. But about half-term last year, I very foolishly locked myself out of my apartment. And a very nice fellow came to let me back in, and we sort of started talking about our histories and what we were doing. And he had mentioned wanting to go and study abroad himself, and after he'd done his work, he turned to me, he smiled and said, "It's good for you. You're really living my dream." And I found that quite melancholic and a little sad, and I thought there was a great beauty in the thing he had done, so I sort of wrote this poem for him the following day. The Locksmith. Wrestled in his youth, he says, fitting each white latch shim in the jam so precisely. He goes on about training, California, jerking and shifting the knob and the shims, pinning and prying metal limbs until the handle dislocates entirely. He tries to remember the name of the city, sets the vanquished back in the socket, and plies the screws one by one until the dream, the present, and the door click. Sacramento. Just one more. This is the most building heavy, I guess. I guess a great enjoyer of stained glass, if that is a sentence to be said. And I've written a few poems thinking about buildings and anatomical features, and there's a surprising amount of shared language between the two. This one is thinking about eyes and windows, and that there's a structure in the eye known as the crypt. Many churches and cathedrals have crypts, so sort of the thought behind that. Iris. Mucus and metallic salts, our eyes fired, drawn out between bands of lead, ciliary threads, stained windows, tightening harder round a glorious nothing, or else a matron, a lamb, icons thrust inward by light, carried by smooth muscle through the cathedral of the skull, from the crypts to the folds, a transfer of holy water. When eye and window meet, two coronas flare. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dominic. I feel like the thing I didn't say before is that this is also kind of a treat for me because I work here in PhD training and I bump into these students and sometimes hear about, well, not necessarily students, PhD researchers. I hear about their research, but not necessarily get to kind of actually listen to the writing. So this was really, really brilliant. So I think the first question I had for you all was kind of picking up on, you've all kind of introduced your PhDs a little bit and talked about the fact that that writing poetry might not necessarily be a kind of core part of that, or it's a part of it perhaps. But I know that you were all writers of poetry before you started your PhD research. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about how poetry led to or shaped your PhD project. So how did being a poet inform the research you wanted to kind of do here?
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's funny because actually I don't think I kind of came at poetry in quite an interesting way, because I was really interested in it as a child, and then I kind of went down like the social sciences route. I did sociology, and then I did gender studies, and then over the pandemic I was like, oh, I actually don't want to be doing any of this. Like, I really like it and it's really interesting, but I want to be doing something that allows me to talk about all the themes I want to talk about in slightly more random, unusual ways, because I think often what I've found with kind of the varied ways that people think and experience life, and often experience life really poetically and unintentionally, which we were talking about earlier, I just found it much more interesting to talk about life or make up life in that way. And I just think the kind of outcome or the experience I had of doing that was more interesting. So I think kind of poetry's always been like festering there. But I think I didn't really think how many things could be poems as well, and how many things that just naturally lived or, you know, like, I don't know, were stationary or just kind of you could spot in different places could become something poetic, or, you know, kind of almost led me to translate my own experiences in a different way, or think about things in a different way, I suppose. And then that led me on to this. Dominic?
Oh, sorry, I will not do that again. I will exhale from a distance. Well, okay, I'm awake. I think some also like COVID malaise. I sort of had the reverse, where I feel like I had been really like returning to poetry. And then COVID happened, and then I did like a creative focused master's, and I was writing my very strange, to me at least strange, Frankenstein-esque poems. And we had to do a companion essay, a rather lengthy one, in the second year. And I was like, well, why am I doing this? And is anyone else doing this? And is there a reason for that? So that sort of question for why led me to look for similar poets. And I don't think I really found the answer to my question, mind, but I think that why body and city then sort of led me on to why poetry and city and building and that relationship. And I've just sort of extended that into my madcap search for more answers, but that has inevitably led to many more questions. But it has been fortifying, I think, to find the urban poets, if I can use a very like broad category for that. Because I don't think at this moment, I don't think we talk about urban poetry with necessarily the same urgency or gravitas that we talk about eco-poetics, which is not me saying that eco-poetics and the lovely series that wrapped up last night is not important. So much as I felt there was maybe a gap to be filled and a search to be had in the urban zone, and that's what I've carried on with.
I came prepared. So with what I'm doing, because it's participatory research, and especially participatory research with young people, and some of you here might go on to do research with young people, one of the things that we have to be really careful about is this desire to be taken seriously in research. There's this sort of pressure on us, and that can warp and twist what we see and how we report it. And it's more keenly felt in poetry, I think, because as a poet, poetry in general can be seen as quite niche and elitist and isn't taken seriously by many people, or speaking very generally. I hope everybody here takes it seriously enough. But it's about being a poet. Our question is, what does poetry do for young lives? And I'm very passionate because I felt it did something for me. But I have to come in and be very aware as a poet that I'm trying to be taken seriously as a researcher and taken seriously as a poet for poetry's sake, and just be very conscious that I don't put the hand on the scales and try and tip it, and just tread very carefully as a poet in research.
Oh, fab. That's fascinating as well, because I feel like in your response, Mark, maybe there's two things we want to talk about a bit, which is like maybe the kind of the serious things that you're all interested in your research and with poetry, but also the other sense I got from your selections and also just from what you've been saying there about maybe why you wanted to kind of work on kind of slightly hybrid PhDs that involve research and writing and kind of participatory work, is also thinking about kind of play and pleasure and kind of enjoying writing and being able to experiment. So hopefully we'll find a balance for that in this conversation as well. So yeah, so the next thing I was thinking about was when we all chatted, so maybe this is slightly more serious and then we can move into the play. But when we were chatting a bit before this to kind of think about the connections between all of their writing, and one idea that came up was this idea of the structures and the constructs of poetry. So I wondered if you could all say a little bit about what that idea might mean to you, what that means in your work and your writing. And maybe we don't have to just go down the line this time. We could mix it up.
Wasn't going to do it again. I think maybe dipping more into the sort of architectural, poetic, whatever made-up word I haven't come up with yet. I've been thinking a lot about maybe not so much prosody and meter, but thinking about form, thinking about the structure of words on the page, the organization of space and white space, and how that can sometimes mimic floor plans. Or I found some like very fun experimental sort of architectural pitches of like street plans and street maps. There will be like word maps they'll even kind of concretely make the words look like little trees or little bike lanes. So I think to the extent, and it's not necessarily me doing it, but I think I'm looking for people that are bringing maybe poetry into that space, or people from the other end of things in architecture and even urban planning that are looking for more creative or playful forms and structures, ways of thinking about people and bodies and ways to inhabit, and maybe using written and even the spoken poem to navigate that. Do either of you want to take this next before I breathe too loudly again?
I can. That was great. Yeah, I similarly kind of think about a lot of those things, but I think something for me that I think so much about is kind of like administrative constraint and structure. And I guess what really drew me to the themes that I'm looking at is that kind of guidebooks or guidance guidebooks more so, kind of stereotypically can be quite dull, and have a beginning and an end and are kind of contained in some way and kind of have a direction and a purpose. And not all of them do, and there's a lot of nuance in that, but kind of the general idea, and I think that kind of guides a lot of how we understand like random forms that we come across like in our day-to-day life, and forms that we have to deal with either through like health administration or through just like university administration, all these sorts of different like forms, both that we experience out in the city but also that we like physically have to look at and touch and you know experience close up. They seem kind of really mundane and like everyday, and I think that's why like putting them in conversation with poetry is really interesting, because poetry also kind of, you know, stereotypically has always been something that kind of resists constraint. Even in its most formal forms, it's still kind of going against or being in conversation or in dialogue with something. So I think that's really interesting. I think also something that I forgot who it was. It was actually yesterday. It was Isabel Gallimore speaking, and in her collection Baby Schema, she has that poem Disneyland, which is like you walk through it and you don't, but you do walk through it, and you know you just feel yourself like seeing the signs and the hot dog stand and everything, and you're almost just smelling the like pink gooiness and weirdness and the artifice, but also the kind of strange nostalgia, and I absolutely adore that idea of like taking like a weird little journey through the page, and also like the idea of like poems building themselves up as you read them, and then knocking themselves down as well. So just like noticing how the poet is like working on the poem as it goes along. And I think that's kind of like that experience of walking in the city as well. You see like buildings that are half done, or places that were once empty and now were once full and now empty, and all this stuff. And it's just really fun. Like, it is.
The thing about constructs and structures with what I'm looking at, and there's way too many. I could get really excited about this and tell you all about them, but there's not enough time tonight, so I'm going to focus on a few things. And part of the reason why I read the bridge poem is I think that poetry is a bridge if we're talking about a structure, and it's a bridge in loads of different ways. So a metaphor is a bridge between two concepts. A simile is a bridge between two concepts. Rhyme is a bridge between two words. You know, there's this idea of, I love that poem, Do Not Fear the Animals, because it's all about incongruency, and it's the idea of matching these words. And if the words didn't rhyme, it wouldn't be as funny. And it's also a bridge between the adult and the non-adult. The idea that pre-verbal song takes a bridge over to speech through poetry. You think about early years books, it all has this poetic function to it, nursery rhymes, things like that. The idea that poetry is the bridge between speech and music all the time. But one other structure that I really like, or I think about with poetry, is I've got developmental dyslexia, so that's a particular thing that I'm really interested in, especially with young people. And the structures within poetry, particularly rhythm, builds better reading comprehension with people with dyslexia. The fact that the white space around a poem causes less visual stress for someone with dyslexia. It's why people like Ocean Vuong and Benjamin Zephaniah were drawn to poetry. So even the way it's structured has a kind of access to it. People think poetry is inaccessible sometimes, and yet it can be so much more accessible. It can be a bridge for people.
Oh, that's really, really fascinating. So I really like that idea that poetry is kind of giving you some kinds of formal constraints, but sometimes allowing you to sort of explode those or experiment with them, as well as kind of providing it. And I wondered actually, maybe if I could come back to something you said, Mark. You talked about then working with children as part of your project and trying not to tip the scales in one direction, so maybe kind of giving the students these kind of constraints, but also that ability to play with them. I wanted you to say more about how you manage it, and then maybe I might ask Anita and Domenic. I know you've sometimes done things like workshops, worked with kind of public audiences, so maybe the same question to you. How do you kind of give people that sense of freedom when it comes to poetry, rather than just the sense of the constraints?
So one of the things, Professor Kate Powell, who works here, you may have had the opportunity to work with, and Hackett as well, talk about what's considered the good research child. So there's this sort of construct in youth studies about one particular kind of child gets looked at again and again because of how we look at kids, and we kind of have to create a space where they don't have to comply with the research. So it can be quite frustrating some of the time. I've been sat in a primary school for the last 2 weeks and sitting with kids going, make a film about poetry. And more often than not, they will play on the games, on the tablets, and not be, usually that's seen as non-compliance. But we have to see that as important data. That's what they would rather do. And that puts poetry in a kind of, in their list of priorities sort of thing. So then this sort of dinosaur game becomes part of the research in a way that you would hope that maybe you would engage with Carol Ann Duffy a bit more. But you just have to sort of sit back and go, okay, and allow them to do. It's the messiness of participatory research.
I don't know that I have any particularly neat and clean examples, because I'm very tardy in actually getting my ethics approved to go out and do field work. But if I can try and take a spin on this, and thinking about participation, I think also just about respect and how we engage with other poets. More and more I think about writing the thesis and doing this project. And I keep thinking of myself more as someone putting together an anthology rather than shouting at my soapbox about weird bodybuilding poems and like the great intense, need for urban poetry. And I think to an extent, speaking to what Mark said, in the same sense that you can't necessarily override the need for the dinosaur content. Very early on, I found out very quickly that you can try and narrow and try and cherry pick poems and poets for the sorts of things that interest you or you're looking for, but you will very seldom find any one poet or even any one poem that might have exactly what your preconception was out to get. But I think you will always obtain new things even in that process. And that's something, ironically, is long-winded as a PhD, is very good about bringing all those disparate elements together to say something meaningful as a whole. And I'm hoping to maybe do something of an interview series and go out and talk to some architects and maybe some urban planners, but especially some poets. And I will have sort of a few guideline questions and a few of my like burning neurotic talking points to start, but I really don't expect that I will be driving towards any one thing in the end. And I don't even know that I'm looking for answers so much as maybe more interesting questions that can just flood my discussion chapter at the very end.
Yeah, that's great. I think that open-endedness is what it's all about. Yeah, feel free to jump in.
No, I completely agree. I think it's like, I don't know, I think I've done different things with different people. I also only submitted my ethics this year, in my third year. And so I've done workshops and stuff in the first 2 years, but I don't know in what context I can write about them. I can't write about them as research, but I can write about them though. I can talk about them as much as I want. But it was interesting because when I did a poetry residency in the first year, I went to a school in Bolton, and I thought it'd be really fun to do a poetry project around walls, because they really, again, it's a thing that they're really dull, it's not that exciting, and I thought kids already, year 8, so 11 to 12-year-olds already have a lot of stuff happening. They kind of have, I don't know if busy lives, but I feel like to us they probably have quite busy and relatively structured lives, and I just thought it'd be quite fun to give them a bit of time to just think about walls and what their association to walls was. And it was great. I got a lot of really, really dark responses of being trapped in walls, and it was really good because it was people just wrote really weird things and quite pleasantly twisted things, and it was just, I think everyone had a good time because it was just, I don't know if everyone had a good time, but it was fun for me and them, I think, because it was just it was just a bit of silliness. And I think sometimes as well as how we're always resisting, I think in our areas outcome is obviously a thing that's always talked about, and we're always saying we don't want to focus on outcome because it's just it's this kind of scary and structured thing that I definitely agree with. But I think it's also even during the process you don't have to focus on those mini outcomes. It can just be that silliness or nonsense is the entire point of it, and I think it does kind of trigger different neurological things, and can often lead to quite interesting conversations, or even if it doesn't, that's fine. It's just they remember you as that poetry person that came to do a class. And now it's interesting because what I'm doing now with engagement is I've done kind of workshops with different people, but I've started interviewing guidebook collectors, and that's a completely different world, because it's just people who are just wildly passionate about these huge collections of, in one particular case, walking and climbing guidebooks. And one person doesn't even climb, they just collect all the guidebooks, which is I was saying to Helen the other day, it's maybe like an adult version of Kate Powell's Good Research Child, because it's like I got so happy when he said, oh, I don't actually climb, because it's just perfect for me I can just write like 20 pages about this kind of like the guy who collects these things and he has no interest in climbing, which probably isn't even that uncommon, but because I collect things and I don't have that much interest in what's actually in them sometimes. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of, I think, to group together and think about the connections between the people you speak to, and think about like how those conversations, speaking of like hybrid forms, how those conversations like might play out on the page. Because I think it's one thing to like write about different things and what happens, but then it's another thing to like think about like, oh, like, could this interview be presented differently or in a kind of more like poetic way, or could this, you know, this kind of project that you did that was maybe quite academic be like pulled apart in some way? I don't know if you guys have anything, because you're both doing like things like you're pulling things apart. But yeah.
Do either of you want to jump in? I think that's the perfect moment to talk about form in your own writing, and kind of, yeah, how you're playing with form or how you're thinking through. Also, I think maybe for all of you, a slightly open-ended question about what forms your writing might take going forward.
I think there's definitely a more and more discussion these days about trying to remake or remodel the PhD thesis and thinking about format. I don't think it was until I came here a couple of years ago to do my master's that I first heard the term like lyric essay used like frequently, which I don't think by any means that is what I am writing. But I am sort of hesitant to just overload with like flowy academic jargon talking about these things. And I think it's also one of the great joys of working with poetry, in that there's so much subjectivity that it's so hard to like clamp down like this was what the exact intention of the poet was and this is the only way to read it. It just doesn't exist. It's very strange that way, I think, in terms of both the academic and also just as a creative medium, that there's a lot of interpretation and there's more room to give, if not your opinions, but to cite other people's often very angry opinions about what is or isn't a good poem or what the poem is or isn't doing. Which maybe now in 2025 is not that novel of an idea, but I think I'm trying to challenge myself to bring in more interpretive voices and to not be so afraid to politely exchange an opinion here or there in the margins, or thinking about how to discuss other people's work, and how to have that sort of broader discussion. I don't think I have anything more than that at the moment.
Hello, there you go. So with me, I'm trying to do things with white space, aren't we all? But it comes back to this idea of trying to involve things that we wouldn't normally look at, absence and non-participation, or what would have been seen as non-participation before. How do you make space for things? How do you make space for dimensions of nothing, as Susie Scott would say? And because I come from a poetic background, I do play with white space. I always think there are lots of theories about white space, but I always think of Schindler's List, when the list is actually complete and Stern picks it up and says, the list is an absolute good. Around its margins are oblivion. And I always think about that absence and what is in that roaring white space of absence. And we had one of our participants, I won't go into detail, but he had to be removed because of problems at home, and wonderful child, really, really engaged and creative and wanted to be there, but because of his circumstance he had to be removed and we had to withdraw him. And I kind of think about how can I accommodate white space for him. And I was thinking about Caroline Duffy's Education for Leisure that was removed from the AQA anthology, and the anthology was reprinted with the poem removed, and the white page had a simple message on it, which this page has been intentionally left blank. And I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but it's maybe something like that, just for this participant.
I was just going to say, I remember those pages from exam papers, so it's going to give me some nostalgia.
No, that was it.
Oh no, but yeah, I wondered, do you want to say something about you were talking about those meeting all your collectors, the armchair mountain climber? Like, do you know what you're going to do with this, with all this material?
Phrase, armchair mountain. I'm going to steal that. That's fantastic. I do think a lot about armchair travellers. Yeah, it's a great poetic image, I think. Form. Yeah, I think a lot about form. I think actually it's funny though, because when I started the PhD, I had no intention of doing anything particularly wacky with form. I mean, I was going to do some weird stuff with the poems themselves, but I had no intention of blending anything or kind of like playing with critical work. I kind of just thought there'd be I kind of thought I had to have it, where it was the pamphlet, the poetry pamphlet, and the critical essay like I'd always done. And I think I had like one of my first meetings with my supervisor, and he was just like, no, you can just do whatever you want. Like, as long as you justify it, you can do literally anything you want. And I just kept being like, no, you can't, you can't possibly mean that. And we went back and forth with that for like a few weeks, months. And then I was like, oh, I can actually. And then when I realized that, it was kind of the beginning of the end in a good way, because then I just kept finding new people that were doing weirder things. And then I got a bit too attached to almost the weirdness of it. And then I was like, okay, I need to think also about what I'm saying. And I think there's something in that about like white space and negative space as well, where it's like, sometimes it's okay to just like, negative space is in itself a form of kind of experimenting, but it can also be a really beautiful way of just also like, as a poet, sitting with what you're writing and just not being so afraid to end on a particular point, or to, leave a gap there and all that sort of stuff. And I think it was quite refreshing for me to be able to express things in a completely different way. And I think also me and Domenic were talking earlier about how like it's quite, page poetry is such a different, I mean, there's a lot of crossover with performing poetry and etc. But it's like you can experience a poem in such a different way. And often with the things that I read, and I imagine you as well, because a lot of it's so kind of structure and architecture and, for me it's like paper forms and things. It's just, you can experience things in such a different way when you're seeing it, and you're just kind of like holding it, rather than, I suppose, like performing it and thinking about how the word will sound and all this stuff. And I've always just preferred to see something on the page. And I think it goes back to that thing of like form and walking through poetry, because I just think like it does different things to my brain when I'm like, just traveling around the page and all that sort of thing. So yeah, form I've thought a lot about. I mean, my own work is kind of going to be like a hybrid, one of those words that's just everywhere now, like hybrid forms, hybrid text. It's part memoir, part this, part that, but it is going to be that, and I think that's quite freeing, because especially when you're playing with guidebooks, and I've read so many different types of them, it's very fun to be able to think like, well, how is like a thesis gonna shape up in relation to those forms, especially when you look at things like PhD guidelines and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
I was going to say that PhD guidelines sounds very dull in comparison to everything you've been talking about, but maybe as you're interested in guidance and guidebooks, there's a kind of relevance there. This might be a good moment to see if anyone in the room has questions. And I feel like there's lots we could still talk about, but I feel like it might be a good moment. I don't know, I haven't given you much warning that I was going to turn to you. Oh, but we've got a question straight away.
think it's more about, I guess, how do you gain the confidence to not take yourself so seriously that you can't have fun, but then also take yourself seriously enough that you're secure in the writing.
Do I need to repeat that for the live stream? Yeah, so it was a really brilliant question about how you have the confidence to be playful in your work and your writing when you're also kind of dealing with that feeling of whether you're also a serious writer, I suppose.
In my own process, it's no one is ever going to see this. Like, it's just like you're writing something and you give yourself, the waste paper basket is your friend, is that old adage kind of thing. Anything that you produce, you can get rid of. But I think that also comes with a sort of consistency with routine. So long as you're doing it, or for me anyway, I always find if you're doing it regularly, you kind of give yourself the opportunity to make mistakes and to be playful, because tomorrow you'll just start again. If you're not starting again tomorrow, then everything depends on this one moment to write, is how I would say that.
I'm a great enjoyer of very, very silly poems. And I think we think of like all the great tragic ballads and so many others. There are great, beautiful poems that will tear your heart out, and I love them. But I also think there's always a great need for poems to take themselves a little less seriously, and I think satirical poems are a wonderful, wonderful expanse. But I sympathize very much that it isn't always easy to get out the word block bin and start fooling with things. So if I could offer anything constructive, if it emboldens you or anyone else for that matter at all, is if it feels more centering, give yourself a rule to follow and then let the rest go to the wind. Maybe it's going to be this many stanzas, or it's going to be this many lines per stanza. Or for me, who again is terrified of metered verse, but is a great lover of syllabic verse, which is a little more open, I'm going to have so many syllables per so many lines per so many stanzas. Because then at least, even if you hate the poem, you know you did a little, you checked off one little craft box, and you can say that you were practicing, you were doing this, you were doing something while playing. A little bit of a container, maybe, to look at it that way. That would be my wisdom.
Yeah, I think like I've always loved insincerity, maybe not in real life, but maybe in poetry or writing of any kind, because I think going back to what I said at the beginning, I just feel like a lot of the time what we think is sincere and insincere is not what it's like at all. I think also a lot of the time, you know, it's also about, even in real life with personalities and things like that, you know, it's not always about, you know, the first person you meet seems this way and then you realize actually they're that way, and it's I think it's so cool and interesting how complex people are, and it's not often, and I think a lot of the time what I'm trying to say is that like poetry out of all forms I think gives itself this extreme, or people give it this extremely intense, you know, sincere, it's kind of language around it and how we talk about poetry and how it's this and how it's that. And I just think there's like Luke Kennard's work, for example, I love because it just like, it's so insincere that it's so sincere, and it's just great and weird, and you can do so much with weirdness. But I think actually what I was going to say was that what's helped me the most has been just reading extensively like other people's work, because I think when I first started the PhD and also first started writing poems, I just thought, oh, I'm just gonna come out with the stuff that's in my head and I'll just put it on the page, and it just, none of it was good, because it was just like, it's just, you know, it's fun, silly stuff, but it's not stuff with anything behind it. And like, so you can be insincere, but you also do have to have some like kind of something happening behind the scenes. And I think, yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like kind of, yeah. I think it's just this like, yeah, it's reading other people's work. And also I think the main thing I realized, which was actually quite recently, was that whatever you think is really, whatever anyone thinks is really weird, especially when I've been writing, someone else has done much, much, much weirder. And that's what's so great about reading other people's work, because I'll get a bit panicked and think, oh my God, this is too much. Like, this is just like, I can't put this out anywhere. And then I'll read someone's work and be like, oh, okay, this is just like so pure like in comparison. But yeah, that's the main thing I would say.
it might not help with like internal processes, but I have recalled an anecdote. And if you're ever worried that someone will read your poem wrong or that they will be off-put by crassness or insincerity, you would be amazed to what goes over people's heads and you can get away with. I won't name locations or names, but I was in a workshop a few years ago. It was just a free writing exercise. And I ended up writing this very impolite and improper poem that was effectively just about a bad bout of diarrhea. But I'd had like one tasteless like reference to the world wars at the end. And the leader of the session turned to me afterwards and was like, very grave, very serious, seems like there's a lot going on there, a lot to unpack. And afterwards people came up to me and they're like, Dom, that was just a poem about a bad case of diarrhea, right? I'm like, yes. So you never know. You honestly never know.
So we might have time for one last question. Is that, yeah, that would, or two questions. Okay, cool. Lokesh.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed your poetry. What I wanted to ask was that what are the challenges and joys of working with young people? How do you prepare yourself?
Do you want to repeat that?
Oh yeah, sorry. So it was a question about what the challenges and the joys of working with young people are. Is that? Yeah.
Where do I start? Right. I'm shattered all of the time. That is one of the challenges. I think, I don't know, I go in and I always feel kind of like, oh, you know, what we're going to do today, and I'm worried, and how are we going to fill the time? They'll fill the time. And I think they're just so, again, talking about sincerity, they're so sincere. And if you don't, they'll let you know how you're feeling straight away, and that's such a breath of fresh air. You're like, oh, look at this poem. I don't like that poem. Oh, I love this poem. But so when you get them on one thing, and they're like, oh, this is, and watching the films they've produced has just been incredible, because you know they mean every single word. They're not pretending. So when they say that poetry takes them to a different world, or poetry unlocks something for them. I remember one girl saying, poetry takes the sadness and puts it there. And I was just like, I'm done, and just walked out. So it's knackering, but just everything means everything to them.
How do you prepare yourself?
Cold shower, I don't know, the slap in the face. I don't know. I go in, and I think by the end of the first week, I know all of the participants by name, and they'll come in and they go, sir, and that's just all I need to prepare. And they're so scouse, and it's great, and I love that.
Wonder if you'll have a different answer once you've gone to the secondary school kids next, maybe. But
The teenagers. Oh.
Yeah, that's what's coming next. Yeah. Anyone else? We've got time for one more question, I think. If there's no burning questions, then we could be free to kind of mill about and chat a bit more informally. So yeah, feel free to come over and ask your questions in a less public space. But if you could all join me in thanking again these three wonderful poets, writers, and researchers.
I'm sorry, just one more thing, and it bears mentioning. That Fran leapt into leading this with like barely a month's notice and has done such wonderful work, and I would like to give her due honors for that again. Thank you, Fran, for making all of this happen for us.